her marriages to Bruce Willis and Ashton Kutcher, and how the old fears from her turbulent childhood caught her by surprise.
The headline alone seemed almost too dramatic to believe. Demi Moore just finally opened up about Ashton Kutcher, and what she revealed has left everyone reeling. It's the kind of moment celebrity culture lives for. A figure long seen as guarded, protective of her privacy, choosing at last to speak with relentless clarity. For years, the relationship between Moore and Kutcher has been discussed in hushed speculation, tabloid rumor, and occasional public hints. But this sudden, unfiltered telling has cut through all of it. In revealing so much, she has forced a re-examination not only of their union, but of the narratives we tell ourselves about love, power, age, and the lies we hide behind. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. From the moment Moore's voice broke the silence, the shock lay not solely in the details, but in the rawness. She didn't frame it as confession or as vindication. She simply laid out her truth. That in itself is an act of courage. Over the years, her marriage to Kutcher has been framed variously as a bold pairing, the mature actress and the younger rising star, or as an inevitable mismatch. But the reticence behind those public narratives has always obscured what was happening behind closed doors. Now, Moore has torn away that veneer. She has claimed that their marriage encompassed emotional desperation, the undoing of boundaries, and a betrayal of self. One astonishing thread running through her unveiling is the idea that she developed what she described as an addiction to him. Not addiction in the clinical, literal sense, but a consuming impulse to align her identity so entirely with his desires that she lost sight of herself. In chronicling that, she's challenging the conventional view of marriage as a haven. Sometimes it can be a trap. That portrayal shifts the frame. Rather than being complicit in a collapse, she paints herself as someone caught in a cycle of ego, need, and emotional dependency. In her recounting, the age gap, the frequently cited 15 years between them, becomes more than a tabloid talking point. It transforms into part of the emotional architecture of their relationship. That difference in life stage meant that she entered their union with many more lived experiences, more scars, and more expectations. He entered with youthful energy, fewer constraints, so when friction and conflict rose, they lacked equilibrium. She describes a continual push and pull, wanting to be the woman he'd admire, while often functioning as caretaker, vessel, enticing partner, and silent sufferer all in one. Another shock lies in how Moore attributes toxic permission to the fractures in their marriage, a moment when boundaries were eroded by suggestion, when the possibility of threesomes was introduced, not as something desired equally, but as something she felt she had to acquiesce to. She frames that as one of the fissures through which their marriage began to crack. In that moment, control did not rest evenly between them. She allowed lines to blur, in part believing it would preserve connection or prove her worth. In doing so, she opens a window on how people sometimes sacrifice their own comfort in the name of love, and how that sacrifice can become corrosive. Infidelity, she says, was not sudden or isolated. It was not a betrayal visited by a stranger in the night, but a consequence of dynamic erosion, justification creeping in, rationalizations filling gaps. She frames it as a slow unraveling. Each justification, each crossing of boundary, each moment of emotional starvation, creating space for cheating to take root. That account complicates how we typically imagine betrayal. It's not just a dramatic act of disloyalty, it's in this telling an expression of a relationship already hollowed out. Most wrenching, perhaps, is Moore's own struggle with relapse after long periods of sobriety. She describes the road back to drinking and dependency on prescription painkillers as tied to internal fracture lines that the marriage aggravated. The emotional pain, the shame, the sense of failing to uphold her self-image, all those dark corridors became doorways into relapse. The detail of waking up in states of disorientation, disconnectedness, self-judgment, they are louder in this telling than any external scandal. What we see is a portrait of someone unraveling internally. It reframes notions of responsibility. Yes, there are actions to be questioned, but there is also suffering to be witnessed. The revelation of a miscarriage she carried deeply compounds the sense of tragedy she describes. At an age when fertility is already fragile, she says she carried hope for that child. Losing it brought more than grief. It exposed a breach in her expectations of love, security, and the promise of continuity. It forced her to confront the truth that some losses aren't external, but existential. Even that she shared it belatedly after years is a reminder that pain often travels underground, that it festers until it can no longer be contained. In speaking so openly, she challenges our collective appetite for sanitized celebrity stories. We prefer neat arcs. Two people meet, struggle, break up, move on. But she is insisting those arcs are lies. Real lives are messy, contradictory, shame-laden. Her unveiling rejects the notion that the public only deserves watered-down versions of emotional truth. She's writing with full exposure, vulnerability without apology. Her act of speaking also reframes power dynamics in celebrity relationships. Usually in a pairing, one voice commands attention, the other remains portrait, muse, footnote. Here, Moore recasts herself as narrator of her own story, asserting authority over what was before seen as gossip fodder. In doing so, she forces others, fans, critics, even Kutcher himself, to confront what she knows, what she felt, what she carried. She reestablishes her subjecthood. She is not merely respondent, she is protagonist. This unflinching disclosure also disrupts the casual narratives about women aging, sexuality, vulnerability. Too often, in society and celebrity culture, when a woman voices regret or trauma, she is dismissed as bitter. When a woman owns her pain, she is cast as unstable. Moore's telling resists that. She is middle-aged, battle-scarred, unapologetically reflective. Her decision to speak is a refusal to vanish quietly. It's a rejection of diminished visibility. She insists that vulnerability is not weakness. One clear implication is how this account demands we reconsider how we perceive both participants in their shared history. It invites readers and fans to see Kutcher not only as a public star with charm, but as a man entangled in ethics, boundaries, and power. It asks difficult questions. When someone younger is drawn into a relationship with someone more consuming, what responsibilities arise? When one partner is more experienced, more emotionally scarred, more wary, how do dynamics shift? And when those dynamics become unequal, who pays the price? And how unseen is that price? Another impact is in how we understand forgiveness, reconciliation, and the silence that follows public splits. When couples end, silence tends to become the default. Sometimes that silence is protective, sometimes it's strategic. But what if silence is complicity? Moore's decision to speak threatens that status quo. It pushes the idea that letting go publicly doesn't mean forgetting privately. Her voice echoes in the void left by time. In speaking now, she asks, can we really move on if the wounds remain unspoken? Her revelation is also a cultural flashpoint in the ongoing conversation about female agency. So often when women reveal trauma or regret, they are told to get over it, to move on. Yet here she is in her 60s carrying the weight of her past, refusing to mute it. She recasts agency not as control over outcomes, but as the power to tell one's truth, even when it disrupts convenient myths, even when it demands discomfort from listeners. More than that, this disclosure compels us to re-examine narratives around marriage, healing, and identity. The idea that love redeems us, that partnership heals wounds, those tropes crumble in her telling. Sometimes, love demands sacrifice so deep it erases. Sometimes the person you wanted to save is yourself. Her revelation invites a more generous, more honest idea of personal recovery. Not healing through another, but healing through voice. In revealing so much with no hedging, she transforms the story of their marriage from gossip fodder into something with moral, emotional, human weight. This isn't a broken romance retold for scandal. It is a reckoning. She invites readers not just to shock and gawk, but to reflect, to face how often we authorize our own erasure in relationships, how often we bury conflict and shame in silence, and how often we survive anyway. When Demi Moore opened up about Ashton Kutcher, what followed was not a mere recollection of a relationship gone wrong, but a deep excavation of how fame, intimacy, and identity can intertwine to distort the self. The gravity of her story lies in how it exposes a psychological landscape that many public figures avoid revealing. It isn't about betrayal or celebrity melodrama. It's about the quiet corrosion of authenticity that can occur when one tries too hard to preserve an image of happiness. Her openness stripped away the glamour and revealed the mechanisms of control, self-doubt, and emotional dependence that often thrive in the shadows of power couples. At the heart of her account is a woman confronting the long-term consequences of compromise. What makes it so compelling is the subtlety with which she dismantled the myth of effortless love. In her reflection, love was not a glowing halo around two beautiful people. It was a negotiation of boundaries, a constant struggle between individuality and togetherness. Every act of accommodation she described seemed to chip away at the version of herself that had once been fierce and independent. The emotional gravity came from her willingness to admit that she had lost sight of where her partner ended and she began. It was a confession of invisibility, a recognition that adoration can easily blur into self-erasure. Moore's narrative becomes even more haunting when we consider her status in Hollywood at the time. She was a powerhouse, an actress who had broken through the industry's glass ceiling, commanding salaries once reserved for men. To see her reduced to emotional dependency dismantles the notion that success shields anyone from personal fragility. The dissonance between her public strength and private vulnerability underscores one of her most striking themes. Power in one realm does not translate to empowerment in another. The woman who once redefined female stardom was still capable of being diminished by love that demanded compliance. In describing her emotional submission, she revealed something larger about the cultural conditioning of women, even those at the pinnacle of fame. There's a recurring pattern in which women are taught to mold themselves to fit the desires of the men they love. For Moore, that molding process became a silent undoing. She yielded to expectations she did not set, believing that by doing so she could preserve connection. But in that surrender, she lost the sense of who she was. The deeper tragedy is that she did not recognize the transformation until it was nearly complete. It's a reminder that emotional compromise often happens not through grand gestures, but through 1,000 small silences. Her story then becomes a mirror for anyone who has ever subsumed their identity for love. The honesty of her reflection forces listeners to confront the uncomfortable truth that relationships can be both nurturing and annihilating. It's easy to condemn infidelity or dishonesty, but far harder to face the ways we willingly participate in our own diminishment. By framing her experience as a gradual surrender rather than a sudden collapse, Moore offers a more complex view of emotional entanglement. It isn't a cautionary tale, it's an anatomy of need. The most jarring part of her revelation is not what Ashton Kutcher did, but how she responded to what he represented. He embodied youth, ambition, spontaneity, qualities that perhaps reignited something dormant in her. Yet, as her account makes clear, that attraction came with the cost of imbalance. The age difference, though often treated as a novelty by the media, carried real psychological consequences. Moore was navigating the insecurities of midlife in a culture that glorifies youth, while Kutcher was thriving in the prime of his ascent. That disparity created a dynamic in which she constantly sought validation, mistaking his attention for affirmation. The imbalance became a quiet form of control, not necessarily deliberate, but nonetheless effective. The emotional weight of her story also rests in how she portrays the slow erosion of self-respect. Every boundary crossed became easier to justify. Each moment of discomfort was reframed as flexibility, each pang of doubt suppressed under the illusion of modern love. The introduction of unconventional intimacy blurred distinctions between acceptance and surrender. What she once believed to be an expression of openness turned out to be a dissolution of limits. When those lines vanished, so did her emotional safety. The audience listening to her recollections cannot help but sense the silent desperation of a woman trying to prove she could be enough. This is where her narrative transcends gossip. It becomes a meditation on identity and survival. What happens when a person's worth is tethered entirely to another's approval? Moore's honesty answers that. The self begins to fade piece by piece. She describes the experience of losing her reflection in the mirror, not metaphorically, but viscerally. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had woken up inside a life that no longer felt like hers. The haunting part is that she didn't recognize the moment of loss. It crept in through small concessions that seemed harmless until they became defining. The implications of her openness ripple far beyond her personal story. They expose the mythology of celebrity relationships, the illusion that visibility equals authenticity. For years, the public saw Moore and Kutcher as a model of blended modern love, proof that age differences could be transcended by connection. Her account dismantles that fantasy and forces us to question the narratives constructed around famous couples. What the world sees as glamour often conceals power struggles, insecurity, and manipulation. The curated images of love on red carpets and magazine covers hide the quiet humiliations endured in private. Her decision to speak also punctures the silence surrounding women's emotional pain. Hollywood has long glamorized heartbreak while trivializing the inner turmoil of women who endure it. Moore's candor rejects that trivialization. She brings to light the psychological toll of trying to hold together a relationship built on imbalance. Her story is not about revenge or exposure, it's about reclaiming voice after years of self-censorship. The act of speaking becomes an act of resurrection. She is, in a sense, reintroducing herself to the world, not as an icon or ex-wife, but as a woman who survived her own disappearance. Another profound element in her story is the interplay between body and control. Her miscarriage becomes not just a biological event, but an emotional rupture that symbolizes loss on multiple levels. It shattered the illusion of shared destiny and replaced it with grief that lingered long after the physical recovery. The way she speaks about it evokes a quiet devastation, the sense that her body had betrayed her at the very moment she most needed it to affirm her purpose. That grief fused with the emotional chaos of her marriage, deepening her sense of failure. The intersection of reproductive loss and relational collapse reveals how physical and emotional wounds can reinforce each other, creating a cycle of pain that's hard to escape. What adds depth to her revelation is her acknowledgement of relapse, not simply as a return to substance use, but as a symptom of spiritual exhaustion. Her honesty about dependency reframes addiction not as weakness, but as a coping mechanism for unbearable vulnerability. In that light, her relapse is less about indulgence and more about numbness. It's what happens when one's internal scaffolding collapses and the world offers no soft landing. The image of her returning to old habits captures a universal truth. When pain becomes too immense, the instinct is not always to heal, it's to escape. The courage in her story lies in how she resists portraying herself as victim or saint. She admits complicity in her own downfall, acknowledging how her choices, however misguided, were rooted in longing for connection. This nuance prevents her account from becoming a one-sided indictment. Instead, it's an invitation to empathy, even for the flawed decisions that led to suffering. That's what makes her confession powerful. It isn't about assigning blame, it's about understanding how people lose themselves in love that demands too much. Her openness also reframes the public perception of Kutcher. She does not caricature him as villain, but presents him as part of a dynamic that both participated in. Her restraint in how she speaks of him is telling. It underscores a maturity that comes from reflection rather than resentment. The real antagonist in her telling is not a person but a pattern. The societal conditioning that encourages women to seek validation through partnership, and the cultural forces that glorify youth and control as markers of worth. This story reverberates in the broader context of how Hollywood treats aging women. Moore was once castigated for daring to date a younger man, as though she had transgressed an unwritten rule. That scrutiny alone would erode anyone's confidence. Her account reveals how the weight of public judgment compounded the private strain of her marriage. Every headline, every whisper became a mirror reflecting her insecurities back at her. The relationship, under constant observation, became both sanctuary and stage. The pressure to prove its authenticity may have been as damaging as the emotional missteps within it. What emerges from her disclosure is a portrait of a woman learning to survive disillusionment. Survival, in her sense, is not about triumph, but endurance. She had to rebuild identity not from fame or beauty, but from self-recognition. That's what makes her confession resonate, because it's about rediscovery. The act of speaking becomes her method of reclaiming selfhood, asserting that her worth exists independently of anyone else's validation. That reclamation is revolutionary in a culture that still defines women by their attachments. The implications stretch further into how we understand the dynamics of control. The emotional power imbalance she describes is not overtly abusive, but insidious. It operates through charm, influence, and subtle shifts in perception. One person dictates the emotional climate while the other adapts, until adaptation becomes identity. Her account unmasks this slow erosion of agency. The tragedy is that it often masquerades as love. Her willingness to dissect that dynamic helps others recognize their own entrapment in relationships that look functional from the outside, but suffocate from within. There's also an undercurrent of generational reflection in her words. Moore's experience sits at the crossroads of two cultural eras: the old Hollywood that demanded silence and the new age of transparency By choosing to speak, she bridges those worlds. Her confession marks a cultural pivot from image management to emotional honesty. In doing so, she aligns herself with a broader movement of women reclaiming their narratives after decades of being spoken for. It's not only personal revelation, it's political defiance. Her story also disrupts the narrative that healing must be graceful. She exposes the rawness, the mess, the lack of closure. Healing, for her, is not linear. It's jagged and unfinished. The decision to tell her story publicly is itself part of that process. Each word is a reclamation of dignity once surrendered. The fact that she can articulate the pain without succumbing to bitterness speaks to resilience forged through suffering. It's not redemption she's after. It's liberation from silence. In cultural terms, her revelation forces us to reconsider how celebrity confessions function. Traditionally, public disclosures by stars are strategic, carefully curated for sympathy or publicity. Moore's tone is different. It's unvarnished, at times uncomfortable. That difference gives it authenticity. It's not a performance, but a reckoning. In an age saturated with curated vulnerability, her words cut through the noise precisely because they seem unmediated by agenda. She's not seeking approval. She's reclaiming truth. The emotional resonance of her story lingers because it touches on something primal. The fear of being unseen in love. That fear drives people to tolerate what they shouldn't, to compromise beyond repair. Moore's experience illustrates that love without mutual recognition becomes annihilation. When she describes her attempts to fit into a mold of desirability, it's not vanity, it's desperation for belonging. And when that belonging is withdrawn, the void it leaves is vast. Her courage lies in facing that void head-on. The shockwaves from her revelation are not confined to celebrity circles. They ripple through the broader cultural conversation about gender, control, and emotional authenticity. It challenges the myth that emotional pain can be contained by silence. Her act of speaking is not gossip, it's reclamation of agency. The implications stretch into how society treats women who refuse to disappear quietly after heartbreak. In choosing to narrate her pain, Moore dismantles the expectation that women must protect the reputations of the men who hurt them. At a deeper level, her story also serves as a study in the fragility of identity under the pressure of performance. Being in the public eye amplifies every insecurity. When fame becomes intertwined with intimacy, authenticity becomes nearly impossible. Moore's account demonstrates how fame can isolate rather than empower, making genuine emotional connection harder to sustain. The very visibility that once elevated her became a barrier to self-preservation. Her openness turns that irony into insight. In her reflection, love is no longer a fairy tale, it's an experiment in vulnerability. She exposes its costs without cynicism, acknowledging that even painful relationships can be teachers. Through suffering, she found clarity. Through loss, she rediscovered voice. That transformation is what gives her confession its weight. It's not simply a story of heartbreak, it's an exploration of rebirth through truth-telling. The deeper significance of Demi Moore's openness lies in how it exposes the invisible architecture of celebrity silence. The way public figures learn to curate vulnerability, to turn pain into performance, and to compress entire lives into digestible narratives. Her decision to step outside that pattern is radical because it disrupts the quiet contract between fame and secrecy. For decades, Hollywood has depended on the illusion of composure, the unspoken rule that stars must show beauty without blemish, grace without grief. Moore broke that spell. In doing so, she redefined what honesty looks like in an industry obsessed with denial. Her revelation can be seen as a study in truth-telling as liberation. When she spoke, she didn't simply relive events. She reclaimed authorship over her own myth. That act alone reorients her relationship with the public. Instead of being a subject of gossip, she becomes an architect of perspective. There's a particular courage in confronting memories that once defined you, and then reframing them from a position of wisdom rather than victimhood. She isn't begging for sympathy, she's asserting sovereignty over her own past. That distinction is crucial. It's the difference between confession and command. The shock that rippled through audiences wasn't just about what she disclosed, but about the way she did it. Her tone carried an almost disarming calm, a steadiness that suggested acceptance rather than outrage. That composure made the revelations more impactful because it suggested she was not trying to destroy a reputation, but to illuminate a reality. There was no spectacle, only truth laid bare. That kind of honesty cuts deeper than anger because it comes without embellishment. It forces listeners to confront not just her story, but the universality of what it represents. The quiet unraveling that happens when emotional validation becomes currency. Her choice to reveal the details herself, rather than through a mediated interview or publicist's statement, underscores another form of power. It shows that vulnerability, when wielded deliberately, can be the purest form of control. In telling her story in her own language, she reclaimed the ability to define what was once used against her. That reclaiming transforms pain into authorship, and once a person takes ownership of their narrative, they no longer belong to the speculation of others. Moore's candor wasn't merely personal, it was political. It rejected the industry's long-standing pattern of silencing women's pain to preserve male image or marketable harmony. The reverberations of her openness extend beyond celebrity culture into social psychology. Her story exemplifies the phenomenon of emotional codependency, how self-worth can become entangled with another's attention. What's striking is that Moore doesn't present herself as someone naive or weak. Rather, she shows how easily even the most self-assured individuals can fall into patterns of emotional dependency. The lesson embedded within her revelation is that love without boundaries is not intimacy, it's absorption. The erosion of limits she described speaks to a universal vulnerability, the human instinct to dissolve oneself for the illusion of closeness. Equally compelling is how Moore's story redefines the concept of empowerment. Too often, empowerment is portrayed as a loud, defiant act, a grand rejection or a triumphant rebirth. Her version is quieter, but more profound. It's the empowerment of introspection, the slow rebuilding of self from fragments of regret. By admitting the ways she lost herself, she models a more realistic form of strength. She teaches that empowerment can coexist with fragility, that one can reclaim dignity even while acknowledging mistakes. The honesty of that duality makes her account deeply human and relatable. Her narrative also reframes what it means to age publicly. Moore's reflections are not just about love, they're about time, about how aging in a youth-obsessed culture can distort perception and self-esteem. Her relationship with Kutcher unfolded under the scrutiny of an industry that fetishizes youth and punishes women for growing older. That cultural backdrop amplifies the poignancy of her story. She wasn't just contending with personal insecurity, she was resisting a collective narrative that told her she was becoming less desirable, less relevant. The relationship, in that sense, became both rebellion and refuge, a space where she tried to reclaim vitality in a culture that sought to strip it away. But when that illusion crumbled, it left her exposed to the very insecurities she was running from. Her revelation thus becomes a meditation on the psychological cost of beauty and visibility. The public tends to romanticize fame as immunity from loneliness, but Moore's words dismantle that myth. They reveal that visibility can be a prison, amplifying self-doubt and magnifying every emotional bruise. When she spoke of losing herself, it wasn't just in relation to her partner. It was in relation to the gaze of millions who believed they knew her. The intersection of public identity and private despair is perhaps the most haunting theme in her account. It reminds us that fame doesn't protect from pain. It only ensures that pain has an audience. Another layer of her revelation lies in how it challenges the gendered narrative surrounding accountability. Traditionally, women who speak about painful relationships are accused of bitterness or attention-seeking. Moore subverted that expectation by refusing to sensationalize her pain. Instead, she offered emotional clarity without moral vengeance. That restraint changes the tone of the conversation. It invites understanding rather than polarization. By choosing reflection over accusation, she expanded the space for empathy. Her story encourages a rethinking of how society interprets female expression, proving that emotional honesty can be both disruptive and dignified. Perhaps one of the most poignant undercurrents of her disclosure is the exploration of self-forgiveness. Beneath every detail of regret lies an implicit journey toward reconciliation with oneself. Moore's recounting is not just about what happened, it's about what it took to live with what happened. That distinction is subtle, but essential. Self-forgiveness for her appears not as a single decision but as an ongoing practice, a gradual loosening of shame. By bringing her inner world into the open, she transforms private guilt into shared understanding, and in doing so dismantles the isolation that shame breeds. The courage to expose that level of interiority also reframes the boundaries between celebrity and humanity. In a world where public figures often appear untouchable, Moore's vulnerability collapses that distance. She becomes not a spectacle, but a reflection of collective fragility. The authenticity of her voice humanizes fame itself. It shows that no amount of wealth or recognition shields anyone from the complexities of the human condition. That realization is both sobering and connective. It turns her confession into a communal experience of recognition. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what do you think Demi Moore will reveal about Ashton Kutcher? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.